Okay, no break, guys. Straight into it. After that very sobering session, we now shift gears a little bit. And this session is really about the response to globalization from the private sector, as well as how Indonesia should be responding to globalization or managing globalization by international cooperation. Our first speaker is Manggi Habir, who has had a parallel career in banking and writing. He was for a long time with the Citibank and many other financial agencies, and now with Bank Danamon of Indonesia. And his real passion is really writing, as far as I can tell. He was the correspondent to the Far Eastern Economic Review, was at the 95 Indonesia update, which was on banking and finance, and still continues his writing as a bi-weekly columnist on economics at Tempo. Pak Manggi, you have the floor, 20 minutes.
Good morning. As Mari had mentioned, I was here in 1994 talking about the banking sector. And actually, I was quite optimistic about it in 1994 or 1995. I can't remember exactly. And then in 4 years' time, 4 to 5 years' time, the whole banking sector collapsed. So I think you have to take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. So I'm quite humbled by it. But anyway, I'll try to be very brief because I don't like Mary pushing me. So I'll be talking about the bad things about globalization from a business perspective and some of the good things as well, and then sort of looking a little bit at the future and what the promise is about globalization. So let me start with the bad part. Okay. As we all know, globalization creates more competition. And competition in the business sector means that you have to be able to compete better. And the easiest thing for you to do is to control your costs. Revenue is very difficult to determine, but your cost is under your control. So a lot of companies, when there's more competition, look at how they can economize. And of course, they cut costs on things which they think are not that important. So pollution, sometimes environment problems, labor problems. Those are the things that they try to cut. And I think globalization has a bad impact in those areas. And with all competition, there's winners and losers. And as a result, there is more income disparity. I think there was if you look at Indonesia, when we first opened up during the Suharto period, some Japanese investments came in, and some business groups got a lot of advantage because they got licenses. And after a few years of Malari demonstrations of people that sort of were young enough to remember that, against the Japanese investments, and cars were being burned. And that's sort of a result of investment coming in and income disparity, so social tension sometimes arises. I think the biggest challenge is also for government to try to control it, because I think if you can control the flows, it can be sort of managed. Very difficult, of course, and I think this is the biggest challenge that we all face in the emerging markets. Now let me focus on the banking sector, which I know a little bit more about, but I need to be a bit careful over here. When we opened up in Indonesia in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a lot of banks that were established. It became easier to set up a bank. And we went up to 220 plus banks at that time. And these were not only local banks, but foreign banks as well. And if you look at the capital levels of these banks, it was single digit. It's around 9%, I'm sorry. At that time before the crisis. Basel, this is the BIS standards, was minimum of 8%. Right now in Indonesia, because of, you have to remember, emerging markets tend to be a little bit more risky, so they add on a certain percentage on top of that. So right now I think the minimum is around 12.5%. But at that time we were still sort of just coming up with just 1% above the requirement. And it was because there's so many banks, it became very difficult for Bank Indonesia to supervise all those banks. So it was quite easy to circumvent the prudential regulations. Now, there is a limit to the amount of loans you can provide to affiliated companies. And it's easy to swap it with other banks, right? So a lot of banks were lending to their own groups, and that was one of the problems as well. Another problem was there's a very large US dollar loan portfolio component in their loan portfolio. I think it was around 25 to 30% before the crisis. And so you have a foreign currency exposure. And a lot of the borrowers that borrowed in US dollars didn't cover their position. So when there is a big swing in the exchange rate, they have to bear the cost. Now, if things are okay, if things were smooth, but when a hiccup happens, that's when the problem starts. And this is what happened in 1997-98, when it was a very liquid market during that time. So a lot of funds from overseas were going into the emerging markets, and a lot of sometimes doubtful projects were also being financed. And I think when people got the foreign fund managers were getting a bit worried about the emerging markets, I think they moved out money from Thailand first, and that moved the Thai baht. And then they thought, there's Indonesia, maybe there is a similar problem. So they moved out funds from us as well, and the exchange rate moved, right? It was devalued significantly. If I remember, it was about 2,500 rupiah per US dollar. It went up 4 times to 10,000. It was not right away, but it was in stages. But you can imagine if you have 25% of your loans in US dollars, those are the first ones to go bust. It becomes 4 times. It's just very difficult for you to repay. And as a result of that, they had to close a lot of the banks. We had to merge it, we had to recapitalize it. It was very, very painful. And you can see the graph over here, the green line, it shows economic growth. It went to negative 13%. And there was a lot of insecurity as a result of that, a lot of unemployment, and it was a difficult time. But the good thing was that the global economy was doing very well, so we were able to respond to that. Of course, the IMF, we got money from the IMF. The IMF gave us a lot of requirements, and that, even up till now, is a little bit of a political issue. I don't think the IMF is very popular back home, even up till now. But the good thing about going through that difficult period is that we had a time to clean up our act, clean up the banks. It's like, you're having a heart attack. You start really seriously looking at your diet and doing exercise. And this is something that we had to do. Very painful, but we shrunk the banking sector from around 220 plus. Half of it was gone. It became roughly, right now it's around 118. There is a shift also from corporate banking to retail banking. And over there, what I'm trying to explain is that the risk level becomes less because your loan portfolio is less concentrated. It's not lumpy. It's more granular. And that, from a risk perspective, is a lot more manageable. And this is a good thing. And the reason actually for this, you need to have technology to be allowed to do this. And it took time for the technology to come in to allow consumer banking to really pick up. And if we look at the past, before the crisis, a lot of the banks were lending out loans more than what they got in deposits. So the gap was covered by interbank borrowing, which is very, very risky because those are overnight funds that sometimes are available. And during the crisis, when the dollars went out of the country, there was a liquidity problem in the interbank market, so they couldn't cover a lot of their loans. And that's one of the reasons why their capital shrunk and became bankrupt. But you can see that right now everybody invested in branches and ATMs to get the deposits. So now there is more deposits than loans, which is a good thing from the banking sector. And capital levels, it's doubled, right, from 9% to 21%. So in terms of being able to cushion any swings in growth as well as exchange rates, it's a lot more comfortable currently. And this is one of the reasons why during 2008, when the Lehman crisis happened, the banking sector was quite well maintained at that time. Let me talk about a few other good things. I think competition brings new products and services. And I think the biggest beneficiary here is the consumer. They have more options. The standards are better. The quality is also better. There's new technology and innovation. And if you look at in terms of how it is realized on the banking sector, you have credit cards, ATM, debit cards, you have internet banking, and you have mobile banking currently. I wouldn't go to the other items. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but definitely I think globalization really helped in bringing up the standards and the products that we provide. Now let me talk about the general business segment, because I think after the crisis, I think the big conglomerates, if you really study them, they were all over the place in terms of their portfolio of businesses. And because of the crisis, I think there's a lot of efficiency that they had to do. They cut a lot of their unwieldy conglomerate structure, became more focused. And during the Suharto times, it's who you know that counts, because licenses were more important during that time. And now it was more what you know that counts, which is, I think, a lot better in terms of how the business were run. And of course, because natural resources was so attractive, with China wanting so much of our coal and so forth, a lot of companies which weren't in natural resources went into natural resources. I have a few examples over there. And this, of course, with natural resources, it helps the provinces. I think we talked about decentralization yesterday. But also there's a pressure to comply with international standards. Now, whether this is quality standards, whether it's environmental standards, and I know we're definitely not there yet, and I think our private sector is also quite reluctantly doing that. But I think right now, even selling to Europe is difficult for some of the CPO producers. So they're talking more about it, they're planning about it, they're investing slightly about it, but they still have quite a long way to go. Now, let me talk about the future. This is my last, I got 3 more slides, so you have to bear with me for a while. The globalization is changing. I think after the 2008 Lehman crisis, there is a slowdown in cross-border flows of goods, services, and finance and funds as well. I think McKinsey did a study, and I'm quoting them over here. The cross-border flows peaked in 2007. 2008 was when the crisis happened, and it's down in terms of the cross-border flows as a percentage of world GDP, went down from 57% to 39%. So meaning that the flows of goods and services have gone down. But look at my second point. The cross-border flows of data has gone up 45 times. So in terms of globalization right now, and if you're talking about flows, there is more information flows going on. And the interesting thing of the impact of that on business is that now smaller companies can can start participating in the global market as well. Now, it's not easy. I mean, it's easy to say but difficult to do, but the opportunity is there. And I have a few friends that are translators and writers that now have a bigger market. Now, not all can get it, but it was very difficult for them to do anything about it in the past, but now they can do something about it. And also because of the affordability. Right now in Indonesia, nearly everybody has a handphone. The bank did a study talking to a lot of Indonesians, and I think the biggest thing that they want in terms of physical stuff is two things. They want to have a motorcycle, and they want to have a handphone. And both of them are affordable because you can pay a down payment and you can pay in installments. So it's reasonably available. And the banks have realized this, rather belatedly, I'm afraid, that we need to really change the channels in terms of distributing our services. And the mobile banking is becoming so much more important, especially with the traffic jams that we have in Jakarta. Nobody wants to go to a branch anymore. Okay, 5 minutes to go. What's that? You ruined my flow. Sorry. I think I'm finished with this slide. Another point that I want to make is that technology now is not only the preview of these big multinationals anymore. The smaller companies are also becoming a lot more innovative with technology, IT technology, and therefore local companies right now can buy technologies rather than having to do a joint venture, for example, with a foreign multinational to get that technology. In a way, technology is becoming more modular. So the banks that, let's say I wanted to get a very big, important system to adapt and adopt in my banking system. In the past, I have to maybe look at another bank and talk with them and then maybe do a big deal with them. But now I can buy that with a smaller techie vendor. And that's changing quite a bit. I think the multinationals are also trying to adjust to this new environment. The last point that I think is quite critical over here is that with all this happening, though, Indonesian companies and even Indonesian banks are still inward looking. And the reason for that is primarily because the domestic market has still such a big potential. And if I were a bank and I put a branch in Wamena or in Manado, I can make so much more money than I put it in Singapore. It's overbanked. Or even if I go to Vietnam, it takes so much time for me to understand the market to make money. But while back home, it's still quite unbanked. I had a slide initially about the penetration, which is still very, very low in Indonesia, but I had to cut it because I was worried about the time. Last slide. This is the last slide. I wanted to just give you a glimpse of two companies that are sort of exceptions to the inward-looking norm. One is Indomie, and somebody talked about Indomie, I think, in their last presentation over here. And this is Indofood. It's one of the world's largest integrated instant noodle producer, the Indomie brand. And they control 70% of the domestic market. And it's interesting, they actually corner 15% of the global market. And the interesting what they do is when you go on the Hajj or the Umrah to Mecca, a lot of Indonesian pilgrims love to bring Indomie. The reason for that is very simple. It's very light. It's very easy to bring. It's not heavy, and all you need is boiling water. You put an egg, and you got enough proteins to go. So this Indomie was brought to Saudi for several years, and it became known over there. And so what Indofood did was set up a factory in Saudi, right? And now it's very difficult to set up a factory in Saudi. So what they did was they worked together with a local affiliate. They own everything, but they sold their technology. They sold the marketing brand and so forth. They got sort of, royalties on that and so forth. Did extremely well. I think now they have 3 factories there. And in fact, a lot of the other pilgrims that came from Nigeria, from Morocco, and from Turkey started to understand the Indomie brand. So they've set up also factories in Turkey, Nigeria, and Morocco. Now, Brazil, nothing to do with the Hajj. In Brazil, it was ethanol. Brazil is sugarcane, right? And they do have sugar plantations, this Indo food. And so they're thinking about working together with the Brazilians to set up a factory. 1 minute, okay. Let me go to Gojek. This is a techie company. Those of you who visited Jakarta, you see the green helmets that on the motorcycle, and that is Gojek. It's a young entrepreneur who is competing with Grab, which is a regional similar company, and against Uber. Everybody knows Uber. So it's a similar type of mobile app that they have, doing extremely well. They're gone into Go Food. They've gone into Go Pay, which is giving the banks a little bit of a headache. So they are quite a fast-growing company, and they are open to globalization. They don't mind the foreigners coming in. Now, they are going to New York to try to get more money, and right now they're even talking about $500 million to $1 billion in terms of valuation. So these are sort of course, exceptions, but it's an interesting thing to see that some Indonesian companies are starting to brave the waters overseas. Thank you.
Thank you, Manggi. That was really a good review from the past and to the present. And by the way, Indomie is the only internationally known Indonesian brand in the world. And it's not just migrant work, it's not just pilgrims, but I would say the migrant workers that we talked about in the previous session who also brought Indomie to the Middle East. Our next speaker is Titik Anas. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my former student, my former assistant, and someone who helped me a lot when I was minister, to be the next speaker. She is an economist who graduated from a very famous university called ANU, and an even more famous supervisor, Professor Hal Hill. And she was at the CSIS, still part of CSIS big family, and has now started her own consulting company, Presisi Indonesia, and also teaching at University Pajajaran. Titi, you have the floor.
Halo. Ada kantong. Sini aja. Right. Thank you very much, Ibu Mari. It's such a pleasure for me to present and share some of my knowledge to the very distinguished audience here. Actually, many audience here know more about this than me, but I try to be useful for the remaining of the audience. I have three key messages that I'd like to convey here, so I think I'm more efficient than Acho or Blaine. The first thing that I like to share is that I focus on the economic cooperation, which is the free trade agreement, because if I touch more beyond that, the thing is going to be more complicated. So I'll focus on the free trade agreements. The message that I would like to share is that multilateral and regional not only talk about or not only make commitments about trade and investment, but also many other aspects that help countries, member countries to benefit or to manage well the integration. For example, in WTO, it's not only about trade and investment liberalization, but it's also safeguard anti-competitive behaviors such as dumping and a competition policy. So it's come in a rather full package. Similarly, Indonesia, for example, engaged in a regional trade agreement such as ASEAN Economic Community, and within ASEAN, it also engaged in a number of free trade agreements such as ASEAN-China, ASEAN-Japan, ASEAN-Korea, ASEAN-India, ASEAN-Australia, New Zealand. So there are quite a number of regional arrangements as well. Under ASEAN, actually under WTO, we have not only liberalization but also discipline. Discipline, it's a rule base. So this is going to give headache for Indonesia in the remaining of the years, especially in recent times. Why? Because the WTO already set some kind of rule, and you should follow the rule. Otherwise, you're going to be penalized by other members. I will talk more about that in the next slide. My second point is that under ASEAN, for example, where Indonesia have its most liberal commitment with, we have several examples where the cooperation, apart from the liberalization, also have feature of cooperation that help members to mitigate or to accelerate the process of the integration. I will mention 3 examples. Actually, there are more than 3, but let's focus on these 3, which is single window, visa exemption, and SME development policy. We argue that, by the way, I write these papers with Doni, my colleague who also housed a student in the past. My senior at ANU, but my junior at Faculty of Economy in University of Indonesia. We argue that single window helps ASEAN improve its goods clearance process. So by doing this, ASEAN should be able to reduce the trade costs. In general, developed countries usually have lower trade costs. Importing and exporting across countries will be cheaper across developed countries rather than with developing countries. Why? Because they have modern system and it's also faster. But in developing countries, they are sometimes still using manual processes where, for example, in Indonesia, you have to go through 16 ministries to get documents ready for imports or exports. 16 ministry means if you have to do it manually, you have to go to those ministry one by one to get the needed documents to get to be able to export or importing. Visa exemption facilitate temporary movement of people. I will show interesting graph later on the impact of this visa exemption on the traffic, people traffic across ASEAN. And the SME development policy is actually a kind of a peer pressure for ASEAN members to have market-oriented facilitating their SME to engage in a global market. This is very important for Indonesia because our policy towards SME is more on protecting rather than facilitating them into the market. Let me begin my presentation. This is just the beginning, but I'll do it very shortly. As I mentioned earlier, GATT set the trend of removing protection, mainly tariff and discipline. It's successful in bringing large number of countries to agree on lowering protection. Initially among the developed countries, but later on with developing countries, where Indonesia is part of it. But in the later period, however, WTO was not successful to further liberalize. So not many agreements get consensus across the WTO members. So this creates problem. So basically liberalization under WTO kind of stall. Then since the mid-1990s or early 1990s, we see that regional free trade area, a free trade agreement proliferated or mushroom across the globe. At least in 2017, we have like more than 400 regional and bilateral free trade agreement across the globe. So as I mentioned earlier, the WTO set the discipline. For example, you only allowed to put your most favored nation tariff up to 37% for Indonesia. Usually the tariff, the cap for developed countries is lower than developing countries. So that's the discipline that we have to follow under WTO. In practice, most countries, members of WTO have their tariff, their non-discriminatory tariff lower across time, except a few years for Indonesia at the later, where as I think Arif mentioned yesterday that we have a tariff increase since 2013. Yeah, not only that, actually, not only we have tariff increase, so we basically increase our protection for import, not only tariff but also non-tariff. Why is it happen? Because we have so many FTAs. As I mentioned earlier, our tariff for ASEAN members are already zero, almost 100% of tariff lines or almost all goods. And this creates headache for a government because, of course, some domestic company will ask for protection and they cannot increase tariff because some goods will come from ASEAN or other countries that where Indonesia has FTA with. So because tariff from Thailand is already 0%, they cannot increase, although the WTO allows them to have 40%, for example. Then what the government do is put another non-tariff measures, like you have to have recommendation to import, you have to have license to import, and you have to have certification or many other non-tariff measures enacted by the government. But this creates another problem in recent time because of the deregulation. So the deregulation asks the government to eliminate all the quota system and all the non-transparent measures, because there are a lot of non-tariff measures, so that the government needs to review. This will create another problem. Why? Because you have to tarify them. If you tarify them, it will increase your tariff average for the non-discriminatory one. But you cannot increase it unless you make a new agreement with your FTA partners. So that's another problem. Let's move on to the examples that I would like to share. Apart from the liberalization measures, why we have liberalization? Actually, as Manggi mentioned earlier, to get efficiency to the economy, to get access for better product and services, both in terms of quality and quantity. And apart from that, why we need that? Probably the first day we already discussed why. And here are the example on economic cooperation under ASEAN, which is called single window. Single window is actually a portal where exporters or importers submit their export or import documents in one system, standardized in one portal. So basically, with the single window, it is expected that trade costs of exportation or importation is lower. And the ASEAN committed in 2005. In 2008, should be the largest ASEAN members already have its single window nationally. Yeah, so for Indonesia, for example, we already have the single window in Tanjung Priok, Belawan, Makassar, and a few others largest port in Indonesia. By doing this, it means that if the document is submitted through the single window, the exporters or importers doesn't have to visit each of the ministries, which I mentioned around 16 ministries. The rest of the ASEAN members should have their single window in 2012, and last year supposedly the ASEAN single window is already in operation. What is the difference between a national single window and the ASEAN single window? Basically, the ASEAN single window connected the portal around ASEAN so that the certification can be submitted from the origin and received at the same time at the destination. So by doing this, we should be able to see that the performance of the logistic services around ASEAN improve. We have data from a Logistic Performance Index of the World Bank and Ease of Doing Business from the World Bank, who survey the players globally on the performance. So we should see that between 2010 and 2014, we have improvement in Logistic Performance Index in at least the 6 member countries of ASEAN. If you see this, in 2014, yes, there is improvement in major of ASEAN countries. The Logistic Performance Index itself comprised of 6 elements. So if we see each of the elements, for example, in terms of custom, we have improvement in 2014. The yellow one is the 2014. Each of shipment, ability to find the most competitive shipment, either the same across time or increase, like for Cambodia is increased, but some other countries show deteriorating. In terms of tracking, there are also improvement, logistic services, some improvement, and timeliness, either the same or improve in certain countries. But we will see that in 2016, there might be down or decline in performance, because when you are integrating the system, it means that you might have a hiccup in the system. Your system might not work well. So when the exporters or importers have that, or in processing their imports, they might have the impression that the system doesn't work well. So that's the issue with adjusting the system. So in 2016, we might have the deteriorating of the quality of the performance of the logistic services. In terms of doing business similar indicators, we can see that number of time to export decline. Also, this is 2008 to 2014, and this is 2015 or 2017. Because the way the World Bank calculated the index is different, so we separate the data between 2008 and 2014. Similarly, time to import also declined for a large number of ASEAN countries, either the same or a decline, but a few countries shows that they are not making progress. On the second example is visa-free, where the ASEAN introduced the visa exemptions for traveling within ASEAN for 14 days. and was in 2006. So we see that the increase in intra-ASEAN travel is a bit sharper than before 2006. If we look at the individual countries, we see that Cambodia is having quite a large improvement in the later period of 2000. Similarly, like Laos and Malaysia and so on. The third example is the SME development policy. What ASEAN has is that they try to develop SME and make the policy is accordance to the opening up, providing or facilitating SME into the global market. What ASEAN does is making a commitment that they have policy that improve the institution, access of the SME to finance, access to market, and so on. And what they do as well is that they monitor or evaluate the implementation of the policy in terms of SME policy index. The last one that we did is 2014, where this is the score should be the maximum is 6. Currently, ASEAN is below 4.1, so it is quite below the international standard. The review is done by the OECD and area. So with this kind of initiative, what ASEAN does is that they engage international organization to help them as in evaluating the performance. Also, if I forgot to mention that in national single window, some ASEAN countries get help from the USAID funding. So basically, they engage international donors to help with the improvement of the system. The next review will be available in 2018. Why this SME development policy important? Because if you see from this figure that the share of the SME in export is quite small across ASEAN. Okay, given that, maybe I should go to the conclusion. Yeah. The case study shows that how cooperation accelerating integration by reducing trade costs and so on. In general, multilateral and regional trade agreement benefit members in 3 different ways: introducing competition, anchoring domestic reforms to cooperation, and cooperation. With protectionism on the rise, developing countries are those who will be negatively affected. Why? Because our export is mostly to developed countries or countries that now imposing the protection. So if there is a tendency toward the protectionism, I think it's in Indonesia's position to fight against the protectionism. I think that's probably the message that I need to convey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Titik. The role of international commitments in the past to manage Indonesia's reforms as well as manage the protectionism as well. And I guess the question is, will it play the same role now and in the future? Okay, we have about 12 to 15 minutes for question. Okay, Pak Berlian in the front, and then I'm supposed to go left, right, yeah? So there's one in the middle, and there's one at the back. How about that? Pak Berlian, is the mic here?
Thank you, Bu Mari. My name is Berlian Helmi. I'm just pointing out that Pak Manggi Habir mentions there is something we have to point out that Indonesia has ranked in the biggest market in the global value chain. I think this is one of the what do you call something that is to be considered. And according to the PricewaterhouseCoopers, Indonesia has positioned at number 4 after Vietnam, or maybe after Thailand. I think we have very big potential domestic market, and more than 60% our domestic market has afforded to this potential opportunity in trade and investment by global value change. And then there is an added value that we need to explore with our partner, especially with Australia. This is a big opportunity for that. And therefore, the focus only two things: there's technology and then market force. And in this opportunity, I would like to stress out that in terms of global value change, through bilateral cooperation with Australia especially, in terms of the added value, so we need to underline more how to develop our innovations in technology, like for example financial technology or in services, for example. And secondly, the small and medium enterprises empowerment of SMEs is very important, key in this term. So I think this is one of the point, very importantly, that we need to explore. We need to expose more, especially in terms of our cooperation with Australia.
Okay, is that?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In the middle there, and then in the back. Yeah. Mike over there, please.
Thank you.
And then in the back, yeah, give the mic in the back.
My question comes from thinking about yesterday's economic update when we saw the slide about the 16 or so different structural reform initiatives, and trade facilitation wasn't really part of any of those. But I'm wondering just your genuine sentiment about the prospects for improving trade facilitation within that context of how difficult the structural reforms are, particularly for SMEs.
Okay, the back, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Rudy Purba. Thank you, Pak Habir and Bu Titik, for your interesting presentations. My question is to Pak Habir from the banking perspective. I just want to look at the banking and investment here. If you look at the examples that you gave about Indomie and also Grab, Indomie is actually, I can say, it's actually under a business or a company which has their own local money and they invest abroad, something like that. Grab is quite different because they are asking money coming from New York, from outside, and they bring the money to Indonesia. And so the market principle is still Indonesia. And Indomie, they have Indonesian money, they sell outside, and maybe they invest outside. And maybe BCA is part of the Indomie, maybe help them in the money. And I want to add one thing, just maybe I want to see your opinion about this. Wilmar Sitorus, Indonesian person, invested in Singapore and with Wilmar International, and they invested money. They recently bought CSR, the largest, one of the largest sugar company here in Australia. So they actually got the money from Singapore. I do not know whether you can explain whether they got the money from Indonesian bankings as well, Indonesian banks from Jakarta to buy the shares in Australia. So how do you see it? Money, Indonesian money invested overseas, Indonesian money coming from overseas from New York, and other person invest in Singapore and buy other institutions or companies outside Indonesia. How do you see it? Thank you.
Okay, Pak Manggi and then Titik.
You want to take the trade?
You go first.
Okay, let me try to address your question on the flows of money, right, that you talked about. I think your question was, what are my views on money that, local money, which is Indomie going overseas, right, finance sort of locally, and then going overseas, and then basically also money for Gojek. I think you meant Gojek, not Grab. Grab is a Malaysian company, right? Yeah, Gojek is trying to get money from overseas for a local activity.
I want to see from the globalization perspective.
Well, globalization is flows. I think my view is because it is open, I think Indonesia has, maybe for products and services tend to be quite closed, but for flows, it has been relatively quite open compared to other countries. So in terms of flows, the flow of money coming from abroad to Indonesia for Gojek, for example, allowing them to tap money overseas and bring it back home for a domestic market, that I think is the impact of globalization is there. I wanted to give you an example that it is quite open. And it's not only Gojek actually, a lot of the Indonesian listed companies right now in the stock exchange, a big chunk of it, the money comes from outside. I would say maybe about 40% of money of that is actually in the stock market from abroad. That's quite big. And even our government bonds that is issued by the government, this is a concern as well to the government because a big chunk is owned by overseas investors. And as we all know, if there's any political issue in Indonesia, that money can go out very, very quickly. And this is the concern that we have. We like sort of money coming in from foreigners investing in the portfolio investment, but it is also a risk because it can go out very, very quickly as well. I don't know much about Wilmar. I don't think Indonesian banks are financing equity sort of transactions. It's very risky. Mainly that is done by private equity types of institutions. Maybe I can explain it like that. Thanks.
Okay, Titik, maybe on trade facilitation, and
Yeah.
if anybody wants to answer Pak Berlian's question about innovation and investment between Australia and Indonesia.
Yeah. On trade facilitation, I think it's one of the important aspect that the current government is looking for, but they call it a dwelling time. So what the government wants to try is to reduce the dwelling time, means to unload or loading goods in the ports. So, but if you say, if you see the trade facilitation in a more comprehensive framework, there is an assessment within the government to check how Indonesia can, what is the gap between Indonesia's current trade facilitation status or quality with the one that required under WTO agreement on trade facilitation, and we are still quite far from that. So I think it is quite difficult because you need to adjust a few legal documents, law and regulation to meet the WTO trade facilitation commitment. So we are kind of slowly progressing towards the high quality trade facilitation standard. On the investment, I think we have to. I think we have to see Indonesia moving forward to investors. Yeah, so investors can Indonesia now invest overseas as well. If you see the outflow FDI from Indonesia, although it's still small, it's increasing. So there is a tendency toward that, and the government should facilitate rather than go against that trend. And on the innovation and technology in terms of for the.
What we have to underline that we need to stress out the importance of the investment technology and in products for the added value in the framework of global value chain. So I think this is the best opportunity for Indonesia and Australia moving forward for that.
Yeah, but the status right now is that we are not yet there in the global value chain, Pak. So what we need.
And now we are discussing on the CEPA in the end of this year.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Point. I think your suggestion is taken. Okay.
Should I answer?
I think
a government should evaluate the possibility of CEPA help Indonesia getting into the global value chains, either in tapping the technology or so any kind of possibility.
Okay. Last two questions. One left side and one right side. And I guess Pak Budi, if you can be very quickly. So, oh, I have to, that's Jose. So left here, Jose, and then Budi. Short, please.
Okay, short. I'm Andy Setianto. I'm here actually with University of Indonesia Engineering. I'm actually here visiting my daughter, proudly studying first semester in ANU, School of Politics and International Relations, Bu Mari. So with regard to globalization and Indonesian government policy, the result and lesson learned, mostly to Pak Manggi Habir, I want to question, I have two cases. For example, the first one is you mentioned about the bank deregulation of 1980s, and then it's forex borrowing that seemingly back then seemingly a bit uncontrolled, so or less controlled. The solution was IBRA, which is then now is under KPK case.
Could you keep it short and get to your question?
Yeah, so it has cost taxpayers money. So back then, and then the currency is now at 13,000, which is S&P has back to investment grade. It's now still 13,000, cannot go back to 2,000 anymore. And what is the solution going forward with redenomination? I don't quite agree with redenomination.
Sorry, what is the solution?
Yes, solution for, going forward, we are now investment grade back in 1996.
Right.
What is government policy to make our currency strong again back, like in 1996?
Okay.
And if I can go to the second case.
No, I think just one, because of interest of time. Jose?
Okay, thank you. I'm Jose Rizal from CSIS. I just want to share opinion and also asking question to Titik about the Indonesia's attitude toward cooperations, economic cooperations. I think it is we still need to be more active in economic cooperations, especially including also under ASEAN. Like it is good you mentioned 3 examples of commitments under ASEAN that benefit Indonesia. But from my knowledge, all those not really coming from the interest of Indonesia. We have a lot of other interests that we still need to pursue. Like for examples from the previous sections, we have problems in migrant workers. And in ASEAN, we don't even talk about migrant workers. The protections of migrant workers, the declarations on protection of migrant workers was cancelled to discuss this year. And Indonesia doesn't even try to pursue that kind of interest. I think we should put more pressure. And the question is how to put more pressure to our government to be more active in that economic diplomacy and cooperation. Thank you.
I'm glad I'm not in government now. Pak Budi?
Thank you.
Yeah, there's one.
Budi Rasa Sudarmo, ANU Indonesia Project. My question to Pak Manggi regarding your argument that Indonesian company is very slow in terms of grabbing global market, and the main reason you mentioned is that most of the company looking at local demand. And you give an example that Indofood, after capturing 70% of local market, then go international. I thought that is a problem with that, So you have to wait a local company to grab 70% of the domestic market, then they start interesting to go outside. One of the thing is that it seems to me that the globalization has increased competition between domestic and local company, but within the nation, it doesn't have a healthy competition because Indofood could capture that big share of demand. So, what do you think about that?
Okay, 1 minute each, Manggi and Titik.
Oh, to answer, okay.
Yes.
First about the currency. You were asking about how to make the currency stronger. This is a government question. To be very simple, you need to export more, and we need to get more foreign investments in. So that is one policy that the government is looking at. I think the investment grade that S&P gave makes it more attractive for Indonesian bonds to be sold abroad, and there was quite a big intake of a lot of foreign money coming in, and that sort of strengthens the rupiah. The problem, though, is we need a lot of imports for the country, and as a result of that, we have to spend that foreign exchange that we get to pay for these imports, and therefore the currency right now is relatively stable at 13,000. I don't think it's going to go any lower down to the previous level. I don't think that's going to be quite realistic. But to just keep it at stable is going to be the key challenge for the government, because I think business is always trying to deal with risk. And if the risk of the exchange rate can be stable, it allows you to plan more and allows you to do investments on more longer terms. So I think if the government can just keep it stable, it would be very, very good for investment. Now let me try to answer.
Yeah, quickly, please.
Quickly. But can you do yours?
Yeah, quickly.
And then I can go back
Yeah.
to Budi's question.
Okay, the question that I got. Oh yeah, now working. Thank you. So the question I got from Jose, yes, I think Indonesia should be more active, Jose, and how Indonesia can do that, they have to sort out the domestic affairs first. They have to, so long as they are protectionism, as long as the government is taking the protectionism attitude, they will not be able to be the champion in ASEAN. So we have to sort out that. And how to pressure the government to be more open. I think we cannot pressure, but we should see why they should be more open. And so long as Jose is still active, helping the government, I think we can get there sometimes. Yeah.
Let me try to address Budi's question about whether there is unfair competition or it's not very efficient in terms of the market where Indomie gets 70% market share. And we need to wait for 70% before we're thinking about overseas. I don't, as a business, you don't wait for market share. You wait for opportunity and you look at your margins. I think for Indofood, even selling abroad is much more lower margin. Domestically is still bigger. Now, whether I think 70% is sort of like a monopolistic kind of situation, I really think they started first. Indofood is owned by the Salim Group. The Salim Group is very close to Suharto during Suharto era, and so they had a head start. And you have to remember they started with Bogasari, and Bogasari is a flour mill. So they were able to, raw material-wise, control it as well. So the cost structure is very, very well. Now, don't worry. There is competition in instant noodles. There is mee sedap, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's even sold in Australia. And they're gaining market share as well. So I think there's a reasonable amount of competition going over there. So the issue is, I wouldn't look at the 70%. I would look at, are they doing improper practices that gives them a lot more leeway versus the others? And then I worry about that.
There's also mee mewah. Mee mewah is Mayora. So a lot of competition in me. Thank you very much. Sorry to eat into your tea time, but I think give a round of applause to our speakers.